I'm Kathy Hessler. I'm the Assistant Dean for Animal Legal Education at the GW Law School, and I'm delighted to be here to moderate the first panel. This is our 30th anniversary Animal Law Conference, and I'd like to welcome you to this conference. Before we begin, I'd like to offer special thanks to our platinum sponsors, the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy and Carroll House Furniture. And before we get to begin our wonderful panel with these great speakers, we have a special treat. I'm thrilled to share some very special welcome remarks from Dr. Jane Goodall on video. So join me in enjoying this.
Hello, this is Jane Goodall, and thank you for asking me to say a few words on this, the 30th anniversary of the Animal Law Conference. Seldom does a day go by without a story of shocking abuse of animals, those in factory farms, research laboratories, puppy mills, horse and dog racing, neglected pets, training, sports hunting, rodeo. The list is very long. And this creates feelings of despair and anger in those who are fighting to prevent cruelty to animals, such as all of you. People often ask me if I have any hope that things will improve. So let me explain why, despite the continuing abuse, I do indeed have hope for a better future. First, during my lifetime, and I'm 88 years old now, I've seen many changes for the better. When I went to Cambridge to work for a PhD, despite having no undergraduate degree, I'd been with the chimpanzees 2 years, studying them in the wild. I was nervous. Imagine how I felt when I was told I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have named the chimpanzees. They should have had numbers. I couldn't talk about their personality, mind, and emotions. Those were unique to humans. But I had a wonderful teacher when I was a child, and I knew that in this respect, these erudite professors were wrong. That teacher was my dog, Rusty. Now, more and more people understand that we are not the only sentient beings on the planet. It's a characteristic we share not only with our closest living relatives, the great apes and monkeys, and with other big-brained mammals such as elephants, whales, and dolphins, but with all mammals and with birds, reptiles, octopuses, and so on. And I can't resist sharing that a recent scientific study indicates that jumping spiders may, perhaps, like octopuses, have dreams. More and more countries have introduced legislation that criminalizes cruelty to animals. Some factory farms, research labs, puppy mills, and so on, that have been proved to have violated anti-cruelty laws to animals have been shut down. In other cases, the owners have been fined. There has been increasing investigation into the way horses are trained, investigation into the docking of tails in horses, dogs, and pigs, and it's now illegal in many countries. Many countries, too, have now banned animal performances in circuses and other entertainments. There are whistleblowers risking their jobs to expose the shocking cruelty with which animals in factory farms, laboratories, and so on are so often treated. As a result, all around the world, an increasing number of people join demonstrations and risk imprisonment because of their actions to save animals from harm. As I understand it, animal lawyers gather the facts and file lawsuits on behalf of some animal welfare groups or concerned members of the public against individuals or companies guilty of breaking some law designed to protect animals from such abuse, with the hope, of course, that the guilty party will be punished. Of course, a law is of little use unless it's enforced, and there are powerful lobbies, agriculture, pharmaceutical, and so on, that are prepared to pay a great deal of money to throw out lawsuits that threaten their business interests. But then there are an increasing number of animal welfare and animal rights groups, as well as thousands of concerned citizens prepared to join campaigns, demonstrations, and so on behalf of the animals. I want to highlight the importance of education. It's really encouraging to find that more and more of the most prestigious universities in more and more countries offer courses in animal law. I would like to see also courses in animal ethics, stressing the fact that animals are sentient beings tailored for children of different ages. The Jane Goodall Institute's Roots and Shoots program is a humanitarian and environmental program with members from preschool through university, where it's very strong. This program requires each group to choose at least one project to help animals, and it has active groups in 65 countries and growing. This is creating a network of people around the world who care about animals. And a number of Roots and Shoots members are now studying animal law. The last point I want to make is to emphasize the importance of collaboration and the need to accept that because of the widespread nature of animal abuse, it's necessary to involve everyone in the struggle to make this a better world for them. There are the activists who organize demonstrations and share facts about reports of cruelty from whistleblowers. There are the people who work to educate the general public and the children about animal sentience. And then there's all of you animal lawyers who work often pro bono to protect animals from cruelty through the legal system. We need to pull out all the stops to protect animals in the wild and in captivity. And I just congratulate all of you involved in animal law for the major contributions that you have made. Thank you so much.
We thank Dr. Goodall for those wonderful welcoming remarks that are so apt as we talk about the theme of the conference today, building a better future. And she's a great example of the powerful and positive use of science in legal and other advocacy for animals, which is a great tie-in to our panel this morning. So we have three wonderful speakers on our panel, and our panel is titled Using Science for Progressive Legal Outcomes for Animals. Science is not something taught in law schools, which ends up being a problem. Legal and non-legal advocates need to understand and use science. They need to know what good science is, how to find it, and most importantly, how to use it. And so our panel today will help us explore some of those questions. They'll then take questions from the audience, both in person and online. So if you're watching online, you can submit a question in the chat icon, the Q&A icon, the bottom of your screen. So now I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists. First speaking will be Christopher Rhone. Christopher is a partner at the Canadian firm Branch Macmaster and has substantial experience in criminal animal cruelty cases. He's represented the British Columbia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals since 2002, including the Omer v. BCSPCA case, which went before British Columbia's highest court and sets out the test for interpreting British Columbia's animal protection legislation. Next, we have Dr. Rebecca Ledger, who's an animal behavior and animal welfare scientist. And those are topics she teaches along with teaching animal law, veterinary forensics, and the link between human and non-human violence. She's a frequent expert witness and also runs a clinic focused on companion animals with behavioral issues. And then we'll have Dr. Marino. Dr. Marino is a neuroscientist and expert in animal behavior, intelligence, and self-awareness. She taught at Emory University for 20 years and is the founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project and executive director of the Kimmela Center for Scholarship-Based Animal Advocacy. She's published extensively, co-authored a groundbreaking study demonstrating the first conclusive evidence for mirror self-recognition in dolphins, and has been increasingly called as an expert witness. So we have a wonderful panel. Please join me in welcoming them.
So thank you very much. I think this is the first time I've spoken to a large group of people since probably about 3 years ago. So it's good to be here, and thank you everybody for coming. So what I'll be talking about is I'll sort of be introducing the legal aspect of the expert, and how do we use them? Why do we use them? And then we'll have the actual expert speak. So the first issue is the admissibility of the expert opinion, which you might also call, why do we need the expert? Why is it important for the court to have an expert in a given case? That informs your explanation to the court as to why you need that expert. So this is just simple common law test. It makes sense as well. So whether you're in Canada and the United States, this is the applicable test. So first of all, obviously the opinion has to be relevant to the issues, just as any evidence has to be relevant to the issues. The evidence, the opinion evidence, has to be necessary to assist the trier of fact. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail next. Absence of an exclusionary rule, I won't go into that at this point. Qualifications of the proposed experts. And finally, as often I think happens in animal cases, is the evidence reliable? And so sometimes you're talking about areas that are maybe a little bit esoteric. So is your expert able to explain to the court that what they are saying is a reliable opinion that should be accepted by the court? So this is the necessity point B from the previous slide. So this concerns whether the expert opinion is necessary. And there's a Supreme Court of Canada case which distills the issue down, and this is a popular case in Canada, and it's similar US case law says the same type of thing. So the expert opinion evidence is necessary to assist the trier of fact when the factual matter in dispute is such that the ordinary people are unlikely to form a correct judgment about it if unassisted by persons with special knowledge. And then what is the special knowledge? Well, it's acquired by the expert through study, training, or experience. So you always have to have that curriculum vitae, that resume from the expert showing this is what I've done. This is why I'm an expert in this particular field that I will now be giving an opinion to the court on. Now, the expert as well, of course, is paid by the party that has retained them, but they're giving their evidence to the court. So that ties into the qualification of the expert. Are they qualified in the sense that they're not biased, that they're not just simply helping the person that's paying them? And that's something that the experts here will talk about a little bit later. But essentially, they have to be impartial, and they have to be giving independent and unbiased opinions to the court. Otherwise, their opinion won't be accepted. A lot of times in court, you're arguing that this expert is actually biased, that they're not giving a full picture to the court, and that as a result, the court shouldn't accept what they're saying. So I'll just go through a few of the types of cases that we do rely on experts for. So first of all, animal cruelty, seizure of animals by authorities that are entitled to do so. That's the bulk of what I do. So the BCSPCA has the ability to take an animal away from an owner when that animal is in distress, when they're being treated in an inhumane way, subjected to cruelty. And so experts are called upon in those cases to say what is in the best interest of the animal, because the owner can dispute the seizure of the animal before the tribunal. Hey, I'd like my animal back. I wasn't mistreating it. Well, what does the expert have to say about that? Criminal law, of course. Typically in the criminal context, the prosecutor has to prove that the animal actually was treated in a cruel and inhumane way, that it was in a situation of distress. And oftentimes you need the animal can't speak, can't say what happened to it. You need an expert to be able to explain that this physical injury was caused not by accident, but by the acts of the owner. Or that the animal's behavior is such that, yes, we can tell that this animal was neglected and treated in an inhumane way, beaten or whatnot. Other cases include animal custody disputes, which comes up in family law, where the spouses may be arguing as to who should have that animal. And sometimes, these aren't particularly common cases, but sometimes there can be a debate as to what's in the best interest of the animal, similar to what happens with children in a divorce situation. Wildlife cases as well. What's the environmental impact? I'll touch on one of those cases shortly. We also see this coming up just in typical tort cases. So a dog bite case, what's the behavior that this dog displayed? Was it something that was predictable by the owner or not? And there can be cases where you need to call on an expert to describe that. Another can be an accident caused by an escaping bull. And so you may have to have a standard of care expert in those cases to describe how to properly keep the bull. So those are perhaps a little bit rarer cases. And of course, there's veterinary malpractice cases where an animal was harmed by a veterinarian during a procedure. And so you want to show that the veterinarian had breached the standard of care if you're on for the plaintiff. So with respect to the animal seizure cases, as I mentioned, one of my clients is the BC SPCA, and they're authorized by statute to seize animals that are in distress. They secure a warrant and they go in and they take the animal away. Now, the owners used to go in front of the court to dispute these, but the BC SPCA is very adamant about enforcing it and enforcing the animal rights legislation in British Columbia. And there were so many of these cases that the provincial government decided, well, we're going to actually shunt these over to a tribunal instead to hear these cases. So that's where they're now occurring. And it's a fairly quick process. We do have to use experts quite often to inform the tribunal, who are not experts, of course, inform the tribunal about the situation of the animals. So just as one example, there was a fairly recent decision that I did called McGaw in the BC SPCA. This was a individual who was a dog sled operator, and the allegation there was that he was keeping the dogs in completely inhumane conditions. They were short-haired dogs. They were kept in little dog houses that weren't elevated from the ground. They were cold, shivering. Some of them were going hypothermic. There were numerous, obviously it's a dog sled operation, so there were numerous dogs. They were not fed properly. All, I suppose, in a way to keep costs down. They weren't exercised regularly. They were just chained up next to their individual dog houses, and they were displaying strange behaviors, circling, what they call stereotypic behaviors, just barking for no reason, and so forth. There was deep gouges in the ground from where they would circle and circle throughout the day. Now the owner had experts. He had a Dr. Reynolds, who is doctor of veterinary medicine based in Alaska. He has his PhD from Cornell University, and he's board certified American College of Veterinary Nutrition, used to work for Purina. Also had Dr. Alina Baum, who was a veterinarian, or is a veterinarian, another American. And they were both lovers of dog sled operations, I suppose you could say, and came across as biased during the hearing. We found a number, so this is part of what you have to do as a lawyer. Well, you have to do your research. We found a number of text messages and bulletin board postings online by Dr. Baum in particular, which were criticizing this particular case and what the BC SPCA had done in this case in taking the dogs away from the person. So that was kind of fun to cross-examine her on that. So from our side, we had a veterinarian, Dr. Walton, who oftentimes does testify in these sorts of cases concerning the treatment of the dogs. He had tested the dogs at the time of the seizure and found that their body temperatures were too low. So in other words, they were hypothermic. And we had Dr. Karen Van Haften, who's a veterinarian as well, and she has a 3-year residency in clinical behavior. So she was able to speak to the behavior of the dogs and identify that what they were that these behaviors that we had videotape evidence of were in fact atypical. So the tribunal, here's a couple of the findings that they said, so you can see how these tribunals or courts will treat the expert evidence. Society video from the day of the seizure, the society is the BCSPCA, show a number of dogs demonstrating stereotypic circling behavior. The appellant, that's the owner, argues that the dogs were exhibiting typical behavior for sled dogs and were not in distress. Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Baum support this argument in their testimony, saying it is natural for dogs to bark and get agitated when strangers arrive. The panel prefers the evidence of Dr. Van Haften, who had the opportunity to spend hours with the dogs in their environment. We find that the video evidence supports Dr. Van Haften's description of repetitive behaviors being carried out identically over and over again over time. And so these American experts that testified in the case never actually saw the dogs. And in contrast, Dr. Van Haften and as well as Dr. Walton did see the dogs, and that made a difference. So if you have an expert, make sure that they have all of the facts, all of the evidence before them. It'll show that they're not biased. Well, it will help show they're not biased, and they will then have the preferred opinion. The one other case I'll touch on is a wildlife case that we had. Now there's a BCSPCA Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and one of the, I mean, they do many things to rehabilitate animals, but one thing they were doing was releasing non-native eastern gray squirrels that were found harmed or injured, brought into them, rehabilitated. They were putting them back into the Western environment. Now, these squirrels have actually been on the west coast of British Columbia for hundreds of years, so it's not a new animal that's just there recently, but they do compete with the local squirrels. So the issue was, well, if we're sterilizing them and releasing them, will that be detrimental to the habitat? The ministry was for many years allowing them to do this. That's the government organization that had the authority over this, and then suddenly yanked the permit away. So they're getting these squirrels come in, and then what are they supposed to do with them? Kill them? So they hired me to go in front of the tribunal and argue that they should be allowed to release them. So that was an unusual case where we had a wildlife biologist, Dr. Farquhar, who gave evidence that the release of non-native squirrels was actually not detrimental in the environment when they were sterilized. And the province argued that, no, you should give no weight to him. It's what he's saying is not backed up by the science. But of course, he had numerous scientific studies to back up what he said. He himself had done research in the area, was able to demonstrate the data. And so his opinion was preferred, and the ministry decision was set aside. So just to summarize then, when you have an expert, make sure they're qualified to give their opinion, work with them so that you make sure that the opinion they're giving is actually in accord with what their expertise is. Demonstrate that they're not biased, help them to make sure they're not biased, and that their opinion is something that goes beyond the scope of what a layperson would be able to testify to. That way they're assisting the tribunal. So with those comments, I will end my discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you, Chris. Chris and I have worked together on a few cases with the SPCA, and I think you've always won. It's very good. So I appreciate that he's here to give some thoughts on using experts. My name is Rebecca Ledger, and you can tell from my accent I'm originally British. Am I pressing the right button? There's a little bit here about my background. I'm better without my glasses. I've been in Canada since 2002. I'm a biologist, and I came to Canada just for a year sabbatical at UBC. I was a visiting prof in animal behavior and animal welfare at the University of British Columbia. And 20 years later, I'm still there. And partly it's because I've had this opportunity to be retained as an expert in some very interesting and exciting animal cases. I found Canada has been, the laws are very open to being interpreted, and there's been a lot of opportunity to progress the welfare of animals and the standard of care because of that opportunity that the SPCAs and municipalities have provided to animal experts to interpret the legislation. So we've made some very progressive and exciting, set some very progressive legal precedents in Canada over the last 10 years at least, and I want to share some of those with you. I also just want to point out that, and judges make this mistake all the time, I go to court and I go through my qualifications and they always think I'm a veterinarian, and I'm not a veterinarian, and Laurie's not a veterinarian. You don't have to be a veterinarian in order to provide courts with insight and information that's going to help them understand an issue. Okay. In fact, there is an entire discipline, an entire professional bodies of animal welfare scientists that may be veterinarians or may not be veterinarians, but animal welfare science is in itself its own discipline. We study neuroscience, we study biology, we study ethology, we study animal behavior, we study all sorts of things that are relevant to being able to assess and interpret the welfare of animals. And we don't know how to treat ear infections, and it doesn't matter. Okay, so I work on all sorts of cases across Canada. I work for individuals. I'm often retained by individuals who have had their dogs seized by municipalities who've been considered aggressive, and people want their dogs back, or they want them off death row. They don't want their dogs euthanized. I'm also retained by municipalities when they're trying to make a case for destroying dogs. And I also am retained by many humane organizations across Canada as well, in cases that involve animal cruelty. This is just some of them. I've been retained on over 185 cases to date. And Chris has already kind of sort of helped us sort of understand the variety of cases that animal experts might be involved in. Dangerous dog cases, pet custody disputes, animal cruelty cases, private prosecutions, civil suits, and sometimes animal experts are also invited by municipalities or the provincial or the federal government to provide thoughts and expertise when it comes to developing new policies or new legislation as well. And that's something I think Laurie is just fantastic at. Okay. All right, so this is, Chris emphasized the importance of experts being impartial and unbiased. It is something, even though I grew up with animals and I'm vegetarian and I have a house full of pets and I do love animals very much, it is still very important that the information that I provide to the trier of fact is unbiased and is impartial. And and because as Chris mentioned, if it comes across that we are just trying to sort of say whatever would suit whoever happens to be paying us, whoever's retained us, then our opinion or the weight that's put on our opinion is very quickly diminished. So this is a statement that I put at the beginning of all of my expert reports, and I live and die by this statement. I am aware of my duty to assist the court and not assume the role of advocate for any party, and I certify that this report is made in conformity with that duty, and that if called upon to give testimony, I will do so in conformity with that duty. Okay. So the thing is that I can't change my opinion or just say what whoever's retained me. I'm not going to say whatever they want me to say. However, there is, I believe it's called expert shopping, does happen, where I'm only actually going to be retained finally by somebody who accepts that my opinion is going to be favorable to their case. Okay, so I do inevitably turn down a lot of cases where my opinion is not what the the person who's possibly going to retain me is going to want to hear or see. It's also important that when I'm in court and I'm hearing all the evidence, and that's something that sometimes I just want to give everybody a bit of a heads up, that's something that sometimes is discussed prior to a case is, well, she's a witness. Is she allowed in the courtroom? Is she allowed to hear all the evidence? And it's argued, well, yes, because she's the expert. She has to hear all of the evidence. And if something new is discussed or is raised in the courtroom, the expert needs to be able to possibly change her opinion or give and be flexible in that. So it is important that the experts are in the courtroom or involved fully in the case and provided with all the particulars so that they can change their opinion if needed. Okay, because my role, it doesn't matter who's paying me. My role is to help the trier of fact or the court to make a good decision. Okay. And the good thing is that we have so much information, so much scientific information regarding the welfare of animals, and that I don't have to lie. The science is pretty clear when it comes to how and why animals suffer. Okay. I'm just going to mention, I've only been involved in one private prosecution. This is kind of a hot off the press kind of a case, so I thought you'd all be interested in it. It involves some pretty big actors. A retired lawyer in Ontario called Sandra Schnur set up an organization called Canadians for Animal Protection. And in 2019, she launched a private prosecution where she basically took, and these are big companies, Walmart, Home Depot, Home Hardware, and Canadian Tire and Lowe's to court because they were selling glue board traps. So I'm sure most of you here are familiar with what these are, but for those that aren't, they're pieces of cardboard effectively that are covered in a very sticky resin. And if you have a rat or a mouse problem in your home, you can lay these boards in the sort of the routes that these rodents would typically take. And of course, as the rodents are trying to go from A to B, if they move over the boards, they get stuck. In the best case scenario for these animals is that whoever laid the trap gets there quickly and they are able to release, they can release the animal by wetting them and release the animal outdoors so that it's no longer inside the home. But the worst case scenario is that these animals are left to die on these board traps for days. They die of starvation. They die of dehydration. Sometimes they chew their own limbs off in order to escape the glue board. Sometimes they struggle so much they rip the skin and the fur from their own bodies. Sometimes they die of asphyxiation because of the resin and the glue gets stuck in their nasal cavity. But these are currently sold by these large organizations. So these obviously are not kind methods. And that's the key, is that it's a method, but there are more humane ways to do that, or at least less inhumane ways in order to deal with your rodent problem. And that was the crux of the case. So when Sandra retained me to assist with this case, we went through the science and we looked at the nature of suffering that rodents experience when they are controlled using all sorts of methods, various methods. And what we were very clearly to demonstrate based on many peer-reviewed scientific papers was that this is probably one of the most inhumane methods. It's therefore unnecessary to use these methods because there are other methods to control rodents that cause less suffering. Hence, this is unnecessary. Now, she's had, she made some progress and then she had a bit of a setback with the courts. So initially, Superior Court Justice Lorne Sosin said of the case, several of the issues raised by Canadians for Animal Protection have merit and deserve to be heard before a court. Those seeking public interest standing must meet 3 criteria by demonstrating that 1, they are raising a genuine issue of justice, 2, they have a real stake of interest in the subject, and 3, they are using court resources properly by raising an issue that can be effectively addressed in that setting. So the first 2 parts of the test, the Justice Sosin agreed had been met, but not the third. She said that Sandra Schnur had failed on the third grounds that she had had yet to pursue the matter through other channels. What she said was that, did you report this to the SPCA? Did you go to the police before you do a private prosecution? Did you explore these other solutions? So actually, and it's literally hot off the press. So she did that. She basically called the police and they said, well, we're not going to deal with this. And she spoke to the SPCA and they said, I'm not sure we know how to go about this either. So she went back to the court and she said, look, we've explored these other avenues. Now, what do we do? And just 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, Wold-Michael delivered his decision. And what he said was that, unfortunately, he ruled that he could not proceed with the charges based on 2 points. One, that to charge someone with aiding and abetting, a principal offender must be identified. And secondly, that we needed to show that these retailers had sold the glue traps that caused the suffering described in our evidence. So the science is there, but unfortunately, just because of these legal loopholes and such, this case is not able to proceed. So, and I believe that she can't appeal and that there's no written decision. So we're not exactly clear on the reasons why either. So it's really unfortunate because we thought this was a very interesting backdoor way into making some legal changes quite quickly. Anyway, so, but let's go back to some happier stories. I want to talk about a couple of the cases that I've done that I think will be that are more novel, that are more hopefully sort of inspiring to those of you who've considered similar cases before but weren't sure whether or not you could proceed with them. And these are cases where we see often with video evidence or there's a witness statement that describes that an animal has been subjected to harm. And the SPCA may go and investigate and seize the animal, but find that there's no physical injury. There's no broken bones. There's no cuts. There's no bruising. There's no blood. There's no malnutrition. There's no dehydration. Physically, the animal is fine. And yet, if we see a video of an animal being kicked or beaten or yelled at or yanked harshly by a leash or have a shock collar used on it, these kind of things. And one such case came to light in 2014 where a gentleman named Desmond Haig was, the CCTV footage has kind of been a bit of a gift in animal cruelty cases over the last few years because people are captured doing all sorts of things when they don't realize it. But what came to light was CCTV footage of this gentleman in an elevator in a building in Vancouver. He was going up the elevator. As he got in, he had a Doberman Pinscher puppy with him called Sade. This is her. And in the video, he's seen yanking her on the leash, kicking her, kind of pulling her up by the leash and letting her collapse to the floor. There's no audio, but it appears that he's yelling her as well. And the dog's behavior suggests that she is very scared, that she's very anxious, that she's afraid. So this got leaked to the press and there was a lot of pressure from the public for the SPCA to do something. They went and visited the dog in the home and they found that they seized Sade. There was no physical evidence of any harm, but they felt that they needed to do something and they'd never yet prosecuted a case where there was no physical evidence of harm. So I think I've got 1 minute. I'm about a third of the way through my slides, which I thought might happen. So I'm just going to kind of jump a little bit here. So the SPCA retained me as an expert in that case, as an expert in animal behavior, to interpret, first of all, the conditions that Sade was subjected to that may lead to suffering, and also the nature of the suffering. What would she experience? So what we know in animal welfare science is that there's at least 32 different ways an animal can suffer. And this is within the legislation. Within the criminal code, it states that everyone commits an offence who willfully causes or being the owner willfully permits to be caused unnecessary pain, suffering or injury to an animal or a bird. Historically, the emphasis or the cases were prosecuted when there was evidence of pain or injury, but not suffering. And suffering was kind of an add-on, but no one was ever interpreting it. And I do a bit of a funny test with people, just not to show people up, but just to demonstrate when I meet people who are in this field, can you just tell me what you think suffering means? Can you define it? No one has ever been able to define suffering for me in this kind of forum. But the scientists, we have a definition, and the definition is pretty simple. It means an unpleasant state of mind. Okay, it's a term that refers to the fact that the animal is having an unpleasant experience. And we can, all mammals are capable of at least 32 different negative emotions and sensations that constitute suffering. Right? So regardless of whether or not Sade was injured, she was suffering. She was suffering from anxiety. We could demonstrate that based on the conditions that she was experiencing and also her behavior during the incident. So based on that, I'm just going to flip through this. This is something called the 5 domains model. This is a scientific framework that we use to determine the nature of suffering in animals in these cases. Mr. Haig pled guilty. He was given a $5,000 fine and banned from owning an animal for 3 years. The judge considered other factors in sentencing, such as the personal ramifications for Mr. Haig, who no longer had a job after this whole thing went viral on social media. And this was really groundbreaking. This was the first case in Canada where somebody was found guilty of animal cruelty where there was no physical evidence of harm. So I just want to let you know that that kind of thing can happen. And a good chunk of the 185 cases I've done over the last 6 years, 8 years, have involved these kind of scenarios. So I just want you to be open. Don't dismiss those cases where there is no physical harm, where the vet says the dog's fine, the cat's fine, I can see nothing physically wrong with this. Okay, talk to a behaviorist, and not just any behaviorist. Talk to Laurie, talk to me. Don't talk to a dog trainer. Don't necessarily believe your veterinarian unless they have some kind of board certification in behavior as well. Okay, it is beyond a layman field of study. It is a science. Okay? And the judges have huge respect for us in courtrooms. We have huge successes. They put a lot of weight on our testimony. So we look forward to hearing from you. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to scroll through the 50 slides I did not do. There we go. Yours.
Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome, everyone. I am very happy to be here. Today, I'd like to talk about 3 basic things at a sort of more general level. One, reiterating the fact that science plays a foundational role in animal law and policy, that scholar advocacy is a very important component of that, and that, of course, there are circumstances, and I mean, a scientist need always be unbiased, always unbiased, but that doesn't mean they can't be an advocate for the animals. And so I want to talk about scholar advocacy or scientist advocacy. And finally, I want to tell you something very exciting about the new Animal Law and Science project at GWU that Kathy and I are working on. So first, science plays a foundational role in animal law because it is the body of knowledge that animal legal scholars and practitioners draw upon to do their work. The task of arguing for the rights and protection of other animals depends upon being able to reflect who they are. So all the things you're hearing about what's cruel, what's inhumane, we need to understand who other animals are. And that information comes from the scientific literature. Animal advocates of all kinds, legal and otherwise, need to be able to utilize that science in the most effective way. So here are some examples of science and legal efforts for animals that depend very much upon science and scientific expertise that I have participated in and will be participating in. One of them comes from Canada, and as you know, there was a bill that was introduced several years ago, that Bill S-203, the Ending Captivity for Whales and Dolphins Act, that eventually passed in 2019. And that bill involved a lot of wrangling and debate and between witnesses, eyewitnesses, scientists who brought to bear a lot of the scientifically based, empirically based data and arguments on why dolphins and whales cannot thrive in marine parks and concrete tanks. And I was one of several. Next to me there, you see Hal Whitehead, who's one of the most prominent marine mammalogists in the world. And we talked about the science, not just the science of who dolphins and whales are, although that was very important, but also the claims made by the dolphin and whale industry about how educational it is to see dolphins jumping up in the air in concrete tanks, and how there was very little evidence for those kinds of claims. So what we did is took an empirical scientific approach. And that was foundational to the whole issue of whether or not this bill, which would phase out dolphins and whales, would pass. It was a 4-year struggle. This morning we saw a brief talk by Dr. Jane Goodall, and in that bill, which is now making the rounds in Canada, it would extend basically a lot of the work that Bill S-203 did, but to many other animals, including elephants in captivity. And that's one of the really exciting aspects of this, is the fact that if Bill S-218 passes, then it would phase out captive elephants in Canada, just as it would for other animals as well. Again, the science is the basis for what this bill is doing, and it will require testimony from scientists about great apes, elephants, and big cats. Scientists telling people who these animals are, who they are. There's another act that I've been involved with that's here in the United States, the SWIMS Act. And this is a really exciting piece of legislation. It was introduced very recently in August 2022 by Representative Adam Schiff and by Dianne Feinstein in the Senate. And the SWIMS Act would amend the Marine Mammal Protection Act, as well as the Animal Welfare Act, and it would amend them in two very simple ways. It would prohibit taking, importing and exporting whales for the purpose of public display or entertainment, and it would prohibit breeding of the whales for public display. And as you may know, breeding, that's what has to stop. That's what has to stop in order for these exploitive industries to stop doing what they're doing. And of course, it would allow exemptions for animals to go to sanctuary, such as the one that we're creating in Nova Scotia. But what this act would do would basically do those two things for orcas, beluga whales, pilot whales, a number of other species. It leaves out bottlenose dolphins, which is, it's because they're the most plentiful in the tanks. But the ones that do the worst in the tanks, the orcas and the belugas, those are the ones that are targeted by the SWIMS Act. So those are the ones that are included. It is based entirely on the premise that is now an empirical fact that whales and dolphins cannot thrive in the type of captivity that we see in marine parks. And the science supports this issue. And so we are at the very beginning of this, but we are going to be moving this through. We'll see how far it gets. This is an example of some of the things that scientists are intimately involved with. Here's one of my main points. Scientists can be the most effective advocates for animals. As a scientist, a neuroscientist, I taught at Emory University for 20 years, and I watched as students were told, you cannot be a scientist and an animal advocate. You can't do it. Choose. How unfair is that? And what does that do to our ability, the ability of people like you to go and advocate legally for the animals? So the whole system is set up to create scientists who are afraid to be advocates for animals. I'm here to tell you that's baloney. In fact, scientists can be the most effective advocates for the animals because we spend our lives studying who these animals are. And that is why many years ago, I set up this Kimmela Center for scholarship-based animal advocacy to bring these two together. There is no inherent conflict between science and advocacy. Now, don't mistake advocacy for being biased. They're two very different things. Two very different things. And as a scientist, you have an obligation to stick to the facts, but that does not mean that you cannot use your knowledge to advocate for a better world for other animals. There is an entire domain in which scientists play an important role in legal advocacy for animals, as we've seen on this panel. And scholar advocacy is about developing and expanding that domain. So how do we empower legal scholars and practitioners with science? And that leads me to the last point that I want to make, which is the most important. All of you recognize this lady here, Kathy Hessler. And I want to talk about the fact that Kathy and I have been working for a few years on a project where we bring together science and animal law in a more formal way. And this project has been supported in the past by the Brooks Institute, now has a beautiful home at George Washington University, where Kathy is. And it is part of the Animal Legal Education Initiative supported by ALDF. And it's a new project that brings together animal law scholars and practitioners, policymakers, and experts in the natural and social sciences. And the whole premise of this project is, what can science do for you? What can science do for animal legal scholars and practitioners? What do you need from people like me to be even more successful in your work? So more formally, what would a legal system properly informed by scientific understanding about animals and the harms of their usage look like? And our goal is to create new pathways of collaboration. So what will we be doing initially? Well, we have a team of people who are involved with this. Some of them are here. We're going to begin with some very introductory educational resources that we are going to create, webinars, animal law for scientists, and science for animal lawyers. And by science, I mean two different kinds of science. One, the science of who other animals are, and the science of how our minds work. Because we're animals and we have a specific psychology, and that psychology has to be understood when you're arguing for other animals, because it comes into play. We're going to be creating glossaries of terms, directories of scientific experts who are willing to step into the arena or step up, as I'd like to say. We're going to be increasing our presence in science and animal law conferences and eventually creating courses and curricula. And we now have a listserv at GW Law, and here is the link to it. And Kathy and I can make that available to you as well. But send a blank email there and you'll get a confirmation email. And this is the beginning of not only this project at GW, but also a really formal conversation between science and animal law. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori, and all our speakers. And I have to tell you, I made a mistake for Lori's slides. Thank you. So we've just started two new listservs at GW. One is the animal environmental one, and I gave that information to Lori, and one is the animal law and science one. So we can get that too. So just email us. My apologies. That's entirely my fault. So thank you for these wonderful presentations. We have 2 microphones set up for question and answer period right now. So folks can come on up to the microphone. If you're online, you can put your question in the Q&A and we'll get it read out to you here. I want to just tell you while people are thinking about the questions they might have, that the video recording of this will be available in about a week, and you'll be able to find that on the online platform. To view the recording, you can go to the agenda page, find the session, and click watch on demand. So questions for our panel. Yes, please.
He's on. Hi, Jane McBride, Illinois. I've been involved with cruelty and neglect for about 20 years in the prosecution of same, as well as in environmental law. So I've had the science background a bit. Very interested in the animal welfare science world. How available are these experts? The other problem of cost is, of course, is the cost of getting these experts available. Are you thinking about addressing that? Question for Chris about exclusion of witnesses. It shouldn't be a problem, but it is out in the hinterlands. Have you had to deal with that, or maybe not? And so just would like to get some feel for that. We tend to use dog trainers and not animal welfare animal welfare scientists. And so as this is a wonderful effort, but way ahead of what's going on in most prosecution's offices. So, and as we work on our advocacy bill, which we've got one in the hopper in Illinois, all of this is going to be incredibly important as we train these advocates to be helpful in the prosecution's offices. So just kind of interested in how we're going to inch it up and make these people available.
Well, so lucky to have people like Rebecca here in British Columbia, and numerous veterinarians as well for physical injuries. I haven't had a difficulty finding experts for the BCS-VCA cases that I do. In terms of qualifying the expert before the tribunal or the court, again, it's, I think, educating the tribunal that there is a field of, in particular, animal behavior, because so much of it comes down to the fact that the animal can't speak for itself. You don't have a physical injury demonstrating itself on the animal, as Rebecca said. And so how do you establish that that animal was actually in distress, that it has been treated in an inhumane way? And that's where the animal behavior expert comes in order to explain, first of all, what do they do? What's their background? What's the field of study? Because it's something that the average person doesn't even know exists. And so explaining that, look, there are actual academics, people with a PhD who've studied this area and can now explain to the tribunal, to the court, what's happening. It's been accepted in every case that I've done. I've never had an issue with it, be it a board certified animal behavior veterinarian or an academic PhD in the field. So I haven't had an issue there. There are debates, obviously, between the experts, which we see, for example, with the housing of animals. What size of a crate? I don't think there should be any crate, but what size of a crate can you keep a cat in, for example? Debates between experts on those sorts of things have come up, but I haven't had an issue with respect to having a good roster of experts to call upon. A lot of people want to help out the BCSPCA, a lot of experts, so it becomes quite easy in that way. I don't actually do prosecution, so that's in British Columbia. That's well, throughout Canada, it's the Crown Counsel that takes over there. I interact with the Crown Counsel in the prosecutions, but I actually defend the BCSPCA when their decision to seize an animal is being called into question.
I can add, I don't know if I'm switched on. There aren't that many of us, and there's actually even fewer who are willing to do this kind of work, because it's pretty intimidating, honestly, being cross-examined. And even some judges haven't heard of this discipline, and they'll joke about Dr. Doolittle's about to walk into the dock or whatever. It is off-putting. And also there are a lot of universities who don't want their staff acting as experts. I've referred a lot of prosecutors to people at universities to speak to some of the most eminent animal welfare scientists, and they want to help out, but their deans say no. It can be hard depending on what your case is, for sure. I think. I mean, Chris is lucky because we've established this kind of approach to animal law in BC, like 5 miles from his office. So of course he doesn't have a problem finding experts, but I know other people do. Also, a lot of veterinarians, they don't want to participate either, because they're like, well, I've got clients booked all afternoon. I don't want to sit outside a courtroom waiting to be called, and who's paying me? So it can be tough, but it also comes the other way. Well, I've talked at a lot of scientific conferences where I'm trying to help you guys out. I'm trying to say to the animal welfare scientists, by the way, look, I'm doing this. If you just see a case covered on the news, there's this poor lion in a cage and someone whacks it over the head with a stick, and all about lion welfare, and that's wrong, call the prosecutor, tell them, hey, I'm here, I can give you a formal opinion on this, I can help out. Because right now we don't have this network, we don't have this roster of experts who you can reach out to. We have to find each other, but there's ways to do it. And I think one of the key things I wanted you to know was that these people do exist. You might have to do a bit of digging. You can call me, you can call Laurie, we can tell you who we would recommend. But these people are out there.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, I'm from Zimbabwe, and so far I'm the only animal lawyer who's resident in Zimbabwe. And also I'm new, 5 years old, learning this. Would I qualify as an animal law expert? Because the field is still new, especially in Africa, where we have maybe just one lawyer, one person who has learned this particular field of law, and you are the only person who's a little bit knowledgeable in that particular jurisdiction. But of course, when I'm here, I'm probably the most infant or the most junior person when it comes to this. So is it jurisdiction based or how? Yeah.
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. So one is the area that you're wanting to do. So for example, if you're advocating for changes in law and so forth, that would be something that you could do, I think, in any jurisdiction. If you're advocating within a courtroom, then you would have to be called to that local bar to be able to do it. So for example, what Lori was talking about, a lot of what she does is advocating for change to laws or bringing into force new laws. So she comes to Canada and is doing that. And that's the type of thing that you could do regardless of where you're called to the bar, right?
You know, do we have an online person?
Do judges, how do judges or the court navigate
How do judges in the courtroom navigate science?
how do judges and the court navigate scientific evidence that they do not have the training to interpret and assess?
Oh,
What
yeah,
happened?
That's the role of the expert.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're there to do, is to help them understand the science. You know, our
Right.
jobs are to be communicators, and it is to explain, and we have to be able to do that in layman terms. That's also a requirement of the expert, is to sort of translate all of that information, all of those p-values and data that's in the journals into a format that the judges can understand. That is exactly our role. It isn't to say who's right, who's wrong. We can't answer the ultimate questions in court. It's there to help the judge understand what they need to know and what scientists know in order to make a good decision.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And there's certainly, you know, this is very complex because the judge is a person, comes into the courtroom with a human brain that has all the biases and fears and psychology in there, and how you say something really matters. And you can trigger a judge one way or the other by using a certain word or so. I mean, this is seen over and over again. I've done a tremendous amount of work with the Non-Human Rights Project. And so when you say the word person, people go nuts. They just go insane. And the judge, and so, you know, this is something that you have to grapple with. What are the terms you're using? Are they appropriate? And, you know, in the case of personhood for certain animals, there's a very specific legal reason why that's used, and that is appropriate. But just understanding that everybody in the courtroom is a human being, they're not a blank slate. They come in with fears and biases and psychology. And you have to think about how what you say might impact their motivations or their decisions.
Sometimes the biases are good though. Our first question in a dangerous dog case is the judge got a dog?
Pitbull. Well, that's true too.
It can work both ways.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Marino. Your work on orca culture has been like a huge inspiration to me to like continue to use animal law to try to end orca captivity. And I'm just wondering if, you know, drawing that explicit connection between like the cultural loss that orcas experience in culture in captivity and the like impact on their health, like if that's like bringing an explicit talk about orca culture and just animal culture in general is something that you would feel confident like doing before a judge or before lawmakers.
Thank you. Can somebody reiterate that question so I have all the details?
It's a bit echoey up here,
Or-
isn't it? It was echoey. I couldn't hear it either.
I couldn't, so
sorry.
maybe
I can-
Kathy, if you could just.
I can try to, should I go to the,
If you can just tighten it a little bit and just,
Yeah.
just, because I don't want to put words in your mouth. You want to try it again? Yeah.
yeah, I was just wondering if talking about animal culture, like for example with orcas, if that's something that you would feel confident talking about before a judge, like a judge is looking for like hard science, if that's like something you could like show like hard science for and like make that compelling argument to a judge.
Sure. So I think what you're asking is, would I or someone feel comfortable talking about animal culture in a courtroom, particularly with regard to orcas, for instance? Yes, absolutely. So many years ago, to talk about animal culture was to be laughed out of the room. But we have now a very solid empirical evidence to show that orcas and many other non-human beings have culture in the true sense of the word, not in some weird animal-like sense, but in the true sense of transgenerational transmission. And so, yes, absolutely. And it really would depend upon, for instance, what the actual question was or the context. But sure, that's there. And there are people who would be much better than I am at talking about that, like Cal Whitehead or Luke Rendell or a number of my colleagues who actually have done the studies, the long-term studies to show this. Yeah,
Thank you.
And I think it would be fair to say that you consider that a science.
it certainly is
Right.
science.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah. We have another question.
Hi, I was wondering, are there any qualifications other than education that we should look for when identifying animal behavioral experts?
For the courtroom, I would say it's obviously good if that expert has testified previously. That will give them more respect and credence in the courtroom. What are their publications, if necessary? Have they actually worked in the field? So
Mhm.
somebody could just be fresh out of university, just had their PhD.
Yeah.
They may not be the expert you want. Is it somebody that's actually been doing that work for some time? Because you want somebody who has the experience as well as the qualification.
And what are the routes that we can typically take to identify those experts? I mean, looking at scientific publications or contacting universities?
Yeah, so most universities have good descriptions. So if you go on there, you can see who their professors are, for example. Take a look at their CV. How long have they been doing it? What is their research? What are they actually getting their hands dirty doing?
Mhm.
And so that's one way to do it. Of course, you want to have a discussion with them in advance, probe them a little bit, because that's going to happen to them on the stand. The other side will do that. And obviously they have to be somebody that's interested in wanting to go into the courtroom and give that testimony, or go into the legislature and talk to lawmakers and so on. That's not for everybody. So you want to find the person who's enthusiastic and interested in doing it, coupled with the necessary qualifications and experience actually doing what their professed expertise is.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add that, one of the things that we'll be doing with the Animal Law and Science Project at GWU is trying to create a directory of people who you can go to, scientists who are willing to loan their expertise to legal efforts for animals, and make it a little bit easier for you to find those people who are actually out there.
I say one of the good thing about COVID is that list of availability of people's gotten better, because pre-COVID, I always had to appear in the courtroom in order to give an opinion. Then during COVID, there was a big hold, wasn't there, in cases, and then we went to doing it over the phone or through teleconferencing. So now we can help people across the other side of the country or the other side of the world. So likewise, your experts might be the other side of the world. They don't have to be in the same state as you. Obviously, you have to look and see what your local courts prefer or require in terms of whether or not they want a hot body in the room or somebody on a TV screen is sufficient. But yeah, I mean, I've testified on my bed in a hotel room once on the other side of while everyone was skiing in Whistler, and it can happen. It's much easier now to find just the right expert, and you're not quite so limited by where they're living geographically.
And I think we will have time only for one more quick question. I know there are a couple of other folks waiting. I think Gladys was waiting first, but I'm not positive. Is that right? Oh, okay. Okay. And so then we'll ask the other two folks to talk with our speakers during the break.
Okay, can I ask, wait, is that okay? Sorry. Hi, my name's Sophia. I'm here with Brooklyn Law School. I'm very excited to be here. In my former life, I was a pre-veterinary student and I was going to be a vet. That was what I was going to do. And then I went to a very production farming focused pre-veterinary program for undergrad. And this is where I am now. And I'm still friends with a lot of those people that are vets. And I'm wondering how you guys see future collaborations with veterinarians, especially as like production farming industries, they're kind of getting wise to us all. And the certain things that are taught in vet schools are maybe not necessarily the most ethical, and it is like what works for production farming. But I'm wondering how you guys see that expanding, like, and how that's going to change if veterinarians are saying one thing and then we're saying another thing.
Well, there's a lot of veterinarians studying animal welfare
Yeah.
in agricultural departments, universities all over the world. So,
Mhm.
you know, it isn't a them and us necessarily.
Yeah,
And there's such a strong link between improving the welfare of animals in farm industry settings and productivity increases, you know, better milk yield, higher or lower mortality rate of offspring and that sort of thing. So they're not necessarily, you know, conflicting.
Yeah.
You can find people who are, you know, have that middle ground. And so, sorry, Laura, you can add.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I would say, though, that keep in mind that there's an obvious difference between animal welfare and animal rights. And whereas you are more likely to find veterinarians working with farmed animals who are into animal welfare, and they claim that they are, the question of whether or not, you know, we should be doing this in the first place is really a question that's not often interrogated. And that's where you have an issue finding veterinarians who say, you know, we shouldn't be doing this in the first place. They have a right not to have a hole punched in their side,
Yeah.
you know, and those kinds of things. So it depends upon welfare versus rights.
The one thing I'll add is with veterinarians, as you saw in that one case I had, you can find a veterinarian that will say, you know, two veterinarians that will say polar opposite things when it comes to animal rights and animal welfare. Not so much so with academics, or people with a PhD who've gone in and studied what it really is, who the animal is. So you know, we don't usually have competing experts when we have an academic. We do have competing experts when it comes, it's like the medical doctors in a medical malpractice case. You'll find somebody that will say each side of the coin.
So I know that we're out of time, and I want to thank our speakers